Hiya, I'm Scott. I'm here in Sydney, and yeah, Will and I have worked together on and off for nearly 20 years in Darwin and in Arnhem Land, and Alex and I have been working together for the last 3 years. And I suppose my history goes back to some people may know, being Australians, a band called Yothi Indie, and I worked with Yothi Indie for around about 3 years in the 90s as part of one of the old government apprenticeships that basically you'd go out and work with different people in different areas and different sectors. And a part of that producing and directing and shooting apprenticeship, I got taken on by Yothi Indie and the lead singer, who sometimes we refer to as Mr. Unipingu or Old Man. And yeah, spent 3 or 4 years with him, working in different capacities around films that were controlled by the Yothi Indie Foundation, and I suppose in a Anglo-Saxon term, we would say ethnographic filmmaking, but really it was creatively controlled and culturally controlled by the Yothi Indie Foundation. It wasn't, us as white Australians, Europeans coming in and saying this is what we want to do. It was more driven from a control point of Yothi Indie saying this is what we want. We want to document these things. So inevitably that was led to a whole bunch of different work. It's based on an invitation to country, where as three individuals we're invited through our relationships to work on country, which we'll go into a bit later. But after working in Arnhem Land for a while, I went and worked for the BBC overseas and in the UK for 11 years. And so across many different levels of work in terms of documentary, commercial production, directing, producing, also working in governance around, I worked as a mediator and negotiator with the government as well. So I work in cross-cultural ways around negotiating and looking at mediations on country, and that's another hat that I wear. And yeah, we get invited to work on country with different groups, and today I think we're going to mainly base what we're talking about is one of the organisations is Inulik Arts, and that's where Alex has been working for the last 3 years. And Will and I have a long association, not only with the executive board of people that run Inulik Arts in terms of Binning and Ballender. So Binning is the local name for Aboriginal people or Indigenous First Nations people, and Ballender is the term that is used for us as white people.
Thanks, Scott.
And just following on from that, the three of us were having a little chin wag last night and saying it's kind of strange, tomorrow we're going to be three white guys jumping online and talking a lot about working in an Indigenous space. So that's an unusual thing for the three of us. We would ordinarily prefer to have some of the people in the crew that we do projects working with equally represented in a forum like this, but we weren't able to do that today. So we're just sort of saying we're going to come to it from our own experience in working in this kind of cross-cultural space.
Personally, I think, and I do some work with Indigenous engineering, and so it's nice that you note it and acknowledge it, but I also think it's important that you guys do speak up from your experience, because that will make it accessible to other people who can then, by extension, go to that next step. For me, I think that's pretty important. Yeah,
that's a nice point, Elizabeth. Thanks for that. And I guess as Scott was saying, we were also not quite sure, because we hadn't really attended these before, about what sort of context everyone's coming from. So whether we're international context and the national context. So I suppose painting a picture, you've had some experience, Elizabeth. You were saying before we started the forum kind of properly about some of your experiences up here, and I guess just building on what Alex and Scott were saying. So Inulik Arts is based in Gumbalanya. Another name for that is Oampeli. It's on the other side of Kakadu. It's about 3.5 hours from Darwin. It's a remote community that's cut off some time of the year by floods. So it's across the East Alligator Causeway crossing out of Kakadu and into Western Arnhem Land. And yeah, I mean, just to sort of set the context, as Alex was saying, you know, there's a lot of people there who English is maybe their second or third language or more. And culture is really strong. There are India Like Arts is sitting, in a minute we'll have a look at a little video, but it's sitting right on the edge of a beautiful billabong overlooking rock art filled escarpment country. So that's the sort of context about some of the discussion that we're having today. I suppose just again, and up the front, I think we just thought it was really important to talk, just to mention some of the stuff that as Scott was saying, a lot of the projects that we come into are invitational. So it's kind of like, would you fellas like to come out and give us a hand with some of these ideas, developing them and working together and collaborating? And I think it's really important to state from the outset that it's kind of about mutual respect and building trust. Relationships really important. Relationships is important a lot of the time, every which way, not only at the sort of kinship level, that is important to people in areas like Western Island Land, but also on a sort of ongoing personal level. You know, it's sort of, it doesn't really matter what logo you've got on a vehicle that you drive in on or what uniform you're wearing. It's very much of a personal, well, you know,
Absolutely.
Personal representation.
And your guiding terms in simulation of fidelity and resolution resonate with me as someone who's been living in Western Arnhem Land, and I think like faithfulness to people and to culture, and to be ready to be receptive and listen to how people want to represent their culture is really important. And you need to have that resolve as well. So.
Yeah, for sure.
And Scott, you had a quote about that, I recall.
From the Yothi Indie angle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one principle that I was, and a philosophical principle, was taught from Mr. Unipingu from Yothi Indie in the early days, and it was something that he repeated to the press. And in a national narrative, he would always talk about how saltwater and freshwater comes together, and he saw that as a philosophical metaphor to sort of say to people, you know, black and white can come together and work together. And what are those ideas around working together in a both ways context? And in terms of the bigger story around working in a both ways context, even though that's a Yolngu context, basically from East Arnhem Land, that stretches right across to the western side of Arnhem Land as well, where you're invited to participate, but it is on an equal collaborative level where, you know, the knowledge systems and the epistemology is balanced, and people are prepared to, you know, talk about certain elements of culture to a certain level, and then, you know, take the relationship as it goes and see where it goes to. But there is a guiding principle that you'll see in a lot of academic texts, and say working with ranger groups who do cultural heritage management work. There's always this both ways principle. So any reading that you do, especially around, I know the word best practice gets thrown around quite a bit loosely around what best practice is, but in Arnhem Land, yeah, that both ways idea, I wouldn't go as far to say methodology, but just that both ways concept is something that everyone needs to sort of keep in the back of their mind once people start working together. So there's mutual respect and trust at all times.
When you live and work in Arnhem Land, you have to sign a permit from the Northern Land Council, and if you read this permit, it's very strict what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. It's like you can live in your house and you can travel to work and back, but anything else, if you want to go for a walk on country, if you want to speak to people, you need to get permission from the traditional owners first. And it's unlike anywhere I've been in the world, and I haven't been many places, but it's, you know, it's a very special place where the kind of structures of society that I grew up with in London are kind of very different. And you find it's always best to be aware that you're not, it's a different kind of commons there.
Very true.
And I think it's interesting. I mean, that sort of leads on nicely to in terms of some of the projects we'd like to kind of show you a little bit of today. I guess, thinking really about all of us in the medium, all of us, I guess, thinking about audience. So, who are things for? And that's a big question. So we've been talking about working with whom, and then who are the things for, and in what form and shape do they take? So if people, if sort of invited to come and do some things for an international audience, how do we kind of explore that, and what are the boundaries, and what are the sort of constraints that we need to work within? And then also, what about stuff that's all the way from an international to a national to a very local audience, making things in language for people in the town of Gumbulanya and the area around there, the outstations, and telling stories that they want to do, stories that they want to make, and for people there. So, there's a range of things, and all of that really varies and has its own kind of models, I suppose, going back to what we were saying a bit earlier with JB. There's different models of working.
I'm also thinking about what JB said, and what you've been describing for me is very closely parallel to how we work in simulation. We've got to understand what the client's needs are and how you represent that fairly, but you can't do a one-to-one representation of anything. So you guys are sort of making the same kinds of decisions that a simulation designer or user is making, just like in a different context. But as you were talking, I was thinking that they're exactly the kinds of questions I have to address. If I'm going to design a simulation for somebody, or JB in his aviation and systems thinking, or any of us in that. So there's a similarity in the way you're working and in the way we need to work. And I think there's also a really key thing there about understanding, the relationships among all the needs of the community, the individuals, what the government says, what the land council say, what you want, what you think other people might want. It's a network of relationships, and JB would say, oh, look, you've just built a system diagram, and as soon as you start putting it into action, then you've got all the complexities and uncertainties that go with designing the best possible simulation, or for you and Scott, turning out the videos and the imagery and the communications that everybody will agree with at the end of the day is what we wanted to say. So do you want to show us one of the clips, and we can have a conversation about that? So you've got share screen when you're ready.
No worries. Just before we do that,
Sure.
just to quickly respond to that, taking some of exactly those things you're talking about, what I was saying earlier. If we had some time at the end, last year I was sort of entrusted to build a 360 VR experience for someone who hadn't been bush.
Right.
And what they would maybe thinking about experience, what it may be like for them to experience it from a sort of immersed first person point of view. So I've got a draft of that we might be able to have a look at, but it probably comes forward.
Well, I would say, Will, if you're doing that, then you're in the simulation game. That's a simulation. Exactly. Just 3D and virtual and synthetic and all that. But yep, there you are. And structurally, you're considering the same sorts of issues in that project. As I would be trying to design a new simulation for leadership context in a business. And the background principles and processes are the same. Products are quite different. But right back there, basically same thing.
Similar process, yeah.
Yeah.
Alex, do you want to just give us the background, a quick 1 minute as to what we're going to see in a second? What this is a piece of?
This is a clip from Stone Country TV, which is a project that we did in October last year, that was responding to lots of people in the community really wanted the Stone Country Festival to take place. It hadn't happened for about 8 years, and everybody loved it because the community was opened up to people who paid a ticket, and they could stay on the camp on the Oval and see loads of bands, cultural activities. The there was an exhibition in the church. The art center had lots of extra market stalls, and it was like a big celebration of Western Arnhem Land culture. And so like we were really planning to look forward to having this festival last year, but we had COVID hit, and being remote community, lots of people have like health problems, and so we thought the best way of mitigating these risks would be to hold it online. So we had this Stone Country TV, which is like a televised live performance of the festival, and we invited Will and Scott to come in because they've both got great production expertise as well as working with remote people in Arnhem Land. And for about there was also another musician who came in to help some of the men record music. And so for 2 weeks there was like a whole host of workshops in like television and music production. And what you're going to see is a clip from one of the performances that was broadcast.
Mm-hmm.
And keep your eye out. So it's multi-camera, run by the bidding artists. So the cameras are run in the shape of smartphones with some rigs. You'll see it in the video clip. So I might just press play.
Yep.
Next up, Silveris. I think he wrote this song about me through Deadly Brass. Sitting back outside with my car so by, dreaming of my days with my west on a Boston. Girls talk to boys, boys talk to girls, and there ain't nothing we like more in this world. To the lake, to Deadly Brass, to the lake, to Deadly Brass, to the lake, to Deadly Brass, yeah, to the lake. To the lake, to Deadly Brass, to the lake, to Deadly Brass, to the lake, to Deadly Brass, yeah, to that lake. See you at the window and you walk in by, you don't turn around and you talk to me in front of my face, but you turn around and walk away. Sit around at home, cause nothing else to do. We call these places Animal Day. We call ourselves Friends on a Boston. To the lake, to Deadly Brass, to the lake, to Deadly Brass, to the lake, to Deadly Brass, yeah, to the lake. To the lake, to Deadly Brass, to the lake, to Deadly Brass, to the lake, to Deadly Brass, yeah, to the lake.
Should we stop it there? Yeah. So we could probably keep going with that. There's lots of fun in that clip.
They were having fun.
And there's like, so that's one small clip of 7 live bands festival.
Okay.
Scott, do you want to talk about sort of that real strong kind of governance kind of structure that came about in the lead up to that?
So as part of working with the board that exists, which is a Binning Indigenous board that controls Inulik and is part of a greater governance structure around all the projects that happen at Inulik Arts, inclusive of their commercial interests, which are primarily textiles, some of the work that Alex does, all things that come through the art centres. The art centres in Arnhem Land tend to be a focus and a hub for the community for all sorts of projects and events to happen. You can have artistic governance projects, literary ones, performance-based ones, language groups also work through there as well. So it's quite diverse in terms of how those decisions are made. And when you have external providers coming in, say broadcasters from outside, groups of people that want to maybe work with rock art in a non-academic sense, there's a growing need and a growing force in terms of those governance groups, not only at the Art Centre, but also at the Ranger groups, is to create ICIP protocols around how non-Indigenous people work on country. And ICIP stands for Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property. A lawyer called Terry Janke has brought that very much to the national and public aspect in terms of pushing that further up the agenda. It isn't yet in the process of being made into legislation through the federal system, but it is becoming definitely something that people are talking about within corporations, but also academic structures like film schools, art schools, who are working with Indigenous people, Indigenous students. There's a lot of people sort of putting these documents together, and we can send some of those links on if people are interested in what ICIP looks like, not only within a paperwork framework, but how to also talk about those issues on country, around not only IP in the classical sense, but what does it mean through those governance conversations around for Indigenous people to drive that conversation, lead that conversation, and also that people's voices are heard within that conversation and listened to. And it's not a tokenistic sort of idea that people go, okay, you've given us permission to film that rock art. Well, actually, there's a whole range of people that need to be consulted around filming that rock art. What does it mean to get permission, either on the day or afterwards? Where is that product going? Is it leaving the community? Is it staying in the community? Is it going into an archive? So ICIP helps set a framework. So it's one of the first steps that if people are coming into the community to work, is that the Art Centre would raise topics around ICIP and IP before those initial agreements are made. And as I said, we can forward you some more paperwork if anyone's interested in that. But in terms of governance, you know, really all the projects that the three of us work on, one of the guiding principles is that it has to be driven from those leaders within the community or the organisation. It has to be negotiated on that as a first principle.
And so through that kind of, I mean, we had those discussions really early on in that project, in terms of, you know, where we were going with it all, and just bringing it back from those discussions into technology. So I really liked your quote, what you were saying last night, Alex. Said this is a simulation of a TV studio outside, you know, away from wires, which is in itself enabling the simulation of a music festival. And then that technology that we did in the workshop week, you know, building those rigs, live wireless multiple cameras switching that stream live to the world. People took that technology on and into the rock art arena in terms of documenting and restoring. And we'll show you another clip in a minute. Before we do that, just backing up a little bit to get the context of what the rock art's like. Scott and I did some work with some people who are also artists and work at Inulik, but there's a lot of crossover between rangers and artists in Arnhem Land. In Arnhem Land, but also in Gavalia. And we'll just show you another little clip which is sort of, it came out of, I used to work for the ABC in a project called ABC Open, which was community, kind of facilitating community development media making. And this was a project that came out of that. So we might have a quick look at that, and then if that would be okay.
Yes, please. Yes.
Yep. I'll just bring that up. Yep. Here we go. I'll make that full screen. Can you see that okay?
Yep, coming up good.
We are the Nyanyma ranges. Nyanyma ranges is like a new ranges coming in to look after Anamland site.
Nyanyma means stories, Dreamtime stories.
When you were a boy, it's sort of country looking after you. And then when you grow up, country was still there, you know, and then you got to return back to look after.
This is a country of 5 clans: Murwan, Manilagar, Bonij, Danek, and Manjolmuni. Before another language came in, it's Kumingu. So that's why we talk Kumingu. We're sharing like one water, one big river coming, Mangabo. So upstream and downstream.
It's just the main river crossing called East Alligator River. We call it Mangabo. It's sort of like a main gateway for us in Anamland side. I like to look after my country, all the site, rock art, feral animals, reeds, and also waterways.
My country is red lily. Garibok Nat Nangun red. That means we look after country.
Today we're doing this spraying weed just to protect rock art. If someone walks along and make fire, just go into rock art and then burn the rock art.
Bimgare, that means old painting. It's important for us. Bimgare, we have to look after it. Like these days, why we got big roads, a lot of dust. Used to be no car, only horse. We like to plant new trees, so blocking all them dust. We don't want to lose everything. Some like young people, like they don't know how to paint anymore. They're just learning. Before old people died, we're trying to show them to paint new ones, but it's if gone, that's it, it won't come back.
If you look after rock art, your story and your future culture still can continue living.
Wow, where was the rock art?
Scott, do you want to talk about that?
It's part of the Manilagar Red Lily Estate, which is from the road leaving the Kakadu National Park on the eastern boundary, so heading east towards Gove and Yirrkala. So you're basically heading on the top road out of Kakadu, and then you're heading towards Goombalanya, which is the first large community outside the park on the eastern side. So the Red Lily Estate pretty much runs along the edge of that road where the rangers were driving.
So that's not Ubir.
No, Ubir is back in the park. So
Back.
Ubir is the country is connected in terms of the cultural landscape.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's all, there's different traditional owners for Ubir, but the traditional owner for Red Lily is a gentleman called Alfred Nyengel and his family group. And that's called the Manilagar Estate. So we've been working closely with Namar Rangers probably for about 7 or 8 years.
Okay.
And there's several academics that work in that area as well, from different universities around rock art preservation and research.
Mm. Okay, thanks, Scott.
And interestingly, it's kind of leads on into one other thing we're going to show you. So that project, in terms of going back to what we were saying earlier about audience and who's making what for whom, that was a very interesting thing. So at the time I was working for the ABC, and to be able to sort of facilitate me to be able to work on that project, the ABC, that we want a national story that we can play on a national stage. And so we talked about that with the Rangers and Inyalak, and people were like, yeah, we want to tell that story. But you know, the bigger picture of what we want to do is really to go around with Alfred and lots of important people and collect stories in language about places on country. So it was a double purpose. So you know, it was like sort of, you're talking about mapping that simulation and looking at those relationships. There's a bunch of things there, and the vast majority of it is things that Scott and Alex and everyone there, including some of the Rangers you just saw there, working towards a big database of information. And that little story is kind of that. Here's what we're doing for the national audience, but it's this big thing. Yeah,
part of a much bigger one. Okay, so did you say you had another clip coming up?
Do you want to talk about this then, Alex?
Yeah. So this next clip is was shot at an outstation called Gubble Wannamu, which is about 3 hours drive further east into Arnhem Land.
Right.
And I went there with some of the artists from Inyalak Art Centre, including Gabriel Marugura, whose wife is, it's her country, and his son. And so it's his son's mother's country. So his son is the Jungai, which is like a cultural custodian of that place, which it's not the same as a traditional owner, but it means that he has some obligations and rights for that country too, including, I'm not sure, there's this wonderful artist who's passed away called Lofty Ariel Najamarek, and he painted rock art there. And while we were in Gubble Wannamu, Martha thought that it would be good to touch up a bit of this rock art. And so we filmed him using the same techniques as we had developed and learned for the Stone Country Festival. And yeah, so you'll just see a short clip of Martha restoring this painting made by his grandfather.
And the technology side of it came directly out of the festival. So
Yeah, I'm hearing that. I like that connectedness.
Bim na nagari me. No, bim bom ngay mama ngay me. Au maman me. Lofty bada na jeme. Bim bom na ne last bim ne. So am jalo am gang me bugo nyame. Kuku ne me. Kat bim nyamet mana ni gare me. Ba nyame bim gang me ne de le. Nyo ime.
So he was just saying that that's the last painting made by his maternal grandfather, and water has washed away some of the tail, so he's going to restore it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a white clay pigment mixed with water, and the white clay is traditional painting medium. It looks darker when it's wet.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
And so this switching that's happening wirelessly is being done on an iPad.
Wow.
So it's all happening on an iPad with 4 cameras shooting and editorial decisions being made by people on site.
On the fly. A little bit of discussion about who is going to hold the camera there.
remember. Silk and banyak lama kayak ini no. Anene lengo in me bet no.
That's Mark's father holding the camera there.
Right.
And I guess in a sense, you know, the pace and the detail. This isn't
Slow TV.
yeah.
So does he sort of feels he has the right and the responsibility to repaint the whole image?
That's right, and he's consulted the TOs of the place as well.
Right. Okay.
But,
And where would you use this? Like, aside from being for him as a record, for the community as a record?
this is part of a larger project that's
Right.
looking at what rock art means to Benin people today,
Right.
which involved a number of trips out bush, which to ask Benin people the question, what does rock art mean to you today, and how do we care for it?
Right.
I'm currently editing together more of the stuff that we shot on country. But,
And the ochre, the paint that he's using, is that local or is it something he brought in with him?
yeah, that's local. Yeah, it's
So
given to him by his uncle.
So is there knowledge of trading of colours through
Yeah.
Arnhem Land?
They were traded quite extensively down to Catherine and the Dali River, I think.
Right.
Ochres were valuable trading commodity.
That was the close up of the iPad switching. I mean, it's kind of interesting, just as a little thing to say. You know, we were talking before about resolution and fidelity.
Yeah.
So, you know, if the paintings are fading and that sort of representation is fading, well, this is maybe the next level of fidelity. You know, we're going higher res here.
Yeah, putting it back. Yeah. Yeah, I know of an ochre mine in WA that's no longer there, but was probably mined for anything up to 8,000 years before Europeans arrived. And the archaeologists working on that know that some of the ochre from there travelled east as far as Alice Springs. Just, you know, curious about trade of you know, items like this. And are there older paintings underneath that, or this was a new area painted?
Yeah, I think it looks like there might be some other older paintings, and all over Western Arnhem Land, there's, you know, tens of thousands of amazing images that go back at, you know, they can go back to at least 40,000 years. And it's a part of a living culture, so it's unlike lots of other parts of the world. And
yeah,
so what Inuit thinks is important is that to support this living culture, to support families going to these remote places to share the stories and like create media sometimes, but
sure.
Yeah.
I was just seeing if I could find the other link that we had, which showed a little bit more of this from another angle. Stand by for a second, folks.
Yeah, sure.
I'll just see if I can get that this one. Which one is it? That one? This one.
Yeah.
That one?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to see a little bit more from a different angle. Can you still see that now?
Yeah, it's coming up.
Yeah. So here's another kind of, well, this is the next level of that. This is bringing some photogrammetry into that type of.
Sure. So that's a crocodile. What's the painting on the left we just passed?
It's of a barramundi and a freshwater mermaid.
Oh.
So this is another nice illustration of that fidelity idea, you know. Okay, so if we want to continue to use this as a teaching classroom blackboard, how do we do it?
Yes. And obviously it then makes me think that obviously the paintings were restored and restored and restored over generations, that what we see would have been the most recent iteration of the paintings, perhaps.
Yeah, they were restored and painted over and scrubbed out and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And an art historian said it was a bit like if all of the artists in the Western canon of art history had just used one piece of paper. So this is another place with another young man, Timothy Nabageo, and his family. He went to restore this rock art painting, which is just incredible.
So I guess we've got sort of 9 minutes left, officially. One thing that's was just sort of interesting, I suppose, to think about. So we had a little session last year. This is just like a little clip from a Charles Darwin news article on the CDU website. But I had some rangers from further afield in Arnhem Land, Ramagetting, the Arafura swamp rangers, come in and have a look at some different VR and to think about how they might want to use VR to capture some of the landscape around them for different purposes. So whether it was for training, whether it was for you know, archival purposes, whether it was for sort of representational ideas about capturing, you know, shooting 360 and taking it back to people who are TOs who are unable to go out to their country, and to be able to talk about it and discuss it in a sort of a way that it's accessible when travel's not possible or different times of the year. Or so we had a few really early preliminary discussions about that. For me, just a quick, so another, I'll see if we can make sure this isn't too loud. Maybe, let's see.
Yeah, enable audio, we can turn it down.
Okay. So I was mentioning earlier, I'll just show you a quick flash of this. This was my first endeavor at using 3D Vista software to actually build a Oculus simulation about what it's like to go bush for the first time for people. So that the College of Health and Human Sciences at CDU said, we want people to be able to see what it's like in a remote community health clinic before they go there. And so we had some dreams about plonking out a 360 camera in the middle of a health clinic and seeing all the craziness that goes on. But it was interesting that as I'll just walk through this a little bit. As we sort of started talking to students, it was really interesting how many levels of context I had to move back through, because it wasn't really about what it's like to go bush initially for the first time. It's a lot of students who are coming are international students. They might not even have a driver's license. They may have never driven a four-wheel drive. They don't know what a sat phone is or what a fire extinguisher, never changed a tire. So so we kind of had to kind of back up and do a prototype of this. This is this going to play? Let's see. And one of the most interesting things for me, I'll just quickly touch on this, came out of it. So here is Tony Lee. Is there audio for that? Can you hear that?
No.
No audio. All right. Oh, I'll just talk about it.
You can just do a voiceover.
Is that going to allow me? Oh, I don't know. Anyway,
Yeah.
or maybe it's under there. Here we go.
There it is.
So as the viewer in this you're invited as a participant to actually be one of the students. So in this 360 video, you're an actor who is playing a role. So not only are the actors talking to each other, but they are including you in the discussions, and you have sort of agency inside the simulation as you move through it to make choices and decide on how you react and how you respond to this sort of preparation. And they're in this part right here, they're talking about some of the cultural appropriateness. The student here, she's from Malaysia and she's wearing a singlet, and her supervisor over here says, well, you know, that might not be the most appropriate dress to head out bush in. You might need to change your shirt. And then there's a discussion about that. Tony over here, he's playing the role of a health worker from a different community that's you're ready to go. Yeah, anyway, that's so it was interesting for me to kind of experiment, take some of those relationship kind of mappings that we were talking about earlier and take them. I won't play through this whole thing. They basically go through and decide on how to get vehicles and get organized to do some things. But I just thought I'd show you that because that's kind of maybe where some of that discussion with the Rangers might head into something like this.
Sure.
Yeah, and I guess, Scott, you sort of wanted to posit that question as a sort of a leaving question at the end of the presentation about, you know, what does it, or well, you want to throw it to us about VR and maybe some of the issues and thoughts about working in that kind of space?
Yeah, I'll just let you sort the video out there.
Sorry, I'll get rid of that.
Yep.
Yeah, within the context of VR in Arnhem Land, there's a lot of people working in the space at the moment. Bukalunge Arts have been doing collaborative work over there with, I think, the New South Wales Art Gallery, and they've done some amazing work, which I think is in the gallery at the moment around VR and I think it's 3D projections. So there's some great examples about how that works, and in terms of that collaborative process of Ballender and Jungel, or Ballender and Binning working together around those principles of ICIP and good governance of the idea and where the idea and the intent is going. So there's already some examples out there. In terms of the ranger work that Will and I have done over the years, I think we put in our notes, didn't we, about the cultural heritage management work. There's a few academics working on country at the moment around what does conservation and preservation of rock art look like and what technology is being used, and obviously following all those guidelines and working with the traditional owners on certain possibly public pieces that can be looked at, not sacred pieces which come under the term of jung. And so those public pieces that, say, tourists can look at that may be affected by dust from a road or rain, certain issues, maybe wild feral animals like pigs and horses and buffalo. There's a conservation question and answer that's going on around that, as it has in many other parts of the world around simulation VR, around sacred rock art sites, whether they're in Peru or in France. And certain people have gone into quite large projects to document those cave artworks or whatever they may be. So it's nothing new to Arnhem Land at this point, but it hasn't sort of taken that next level where those rock art sites have become part of a preservation repository that would stay within the community, or whether it would go to a gallery or a site. But that idea of, let's say, a rock art site was documented with VR, would be automatically sent off to an institute in America and kept there as a repository. That idea is not where it's at anymore. The idea is about how do people working in a collaborative way on the ground use good governance models to keep that repository on country, and maybe work with CDU, maybe work with other institutes, but the ideas are starting to move towards how is capacity built on country with young people? Are there jobs that can come out of that? Are there, you know, macro and micro economies that can come out of this work? How do people feel about some of those public artworks being sent out to the rest of the world? So there's a lot of big questions that have to be answered before one dives into that world.
So one of our members here in Sydney is part of an archaeological dig in Egypt, and he's working on rock art, mainly I think mainly carvings rather than paintings that are sort of what they call pre-dynastic. So well before, you know, what we'd call ancient Egypt had even sort of emerged. And one of his session last year was about how they're actually using 3D, the kind of things that you had with the cameras and the headsets and things, as well as just standard photography, to record and document that art in ways that, you know, they haven't done it in Egypt before. So it may be, you know, I know he'll be interested to learn what he's not online today, but he'll be interested to learn what you've been doing, because I can see lots of similarities between those issues you're considering and what he's been working on in Egypt.
What's his name?
I think one of the big questions is how, with new technology, is how can those repositories work on country, and what supports them?
In his day job, he works at Raytheon. In his day job, Fred's an engineer working in building simulators, but mainly for defence. So the archaeology is his passion. He's a doctor in archaeology. So I put his name in there. If you wanted to, you'll find him pretty quickly. But yeah, it's kind of like where I sit. A lot of the technologies and the simulation concepts and things that people are using differently in different places all have an amazing degree of similarity. There's a convergence happening slowly. I'd like to see it speed up, but yeah, by all means, get in touch with Fred. You know, he'd have a different perspective and probably some good ideas to share. So it's 2:00. You've raised a heap of issues. I wasn't quite sure how we could find the connections, but I really love the fact that the connection between what you're doing and what, you know, we do in simulation is right back there at the fundamental principles of who are the clients, how do we work with them, how do we keep it in the right context, how do we remain faithful to it, you know, how do we develop it, what happens as things change, you know, whether you're building a flight simulator or a board game to teach about economics, those questions are all pretty much the same. So it's really interesting to see that, you know, we can make the connections with what you're doing. And I really wanted to thank the three of you for coming on today. It's been a fascinating ride through a very different environment to what we've got here in Sydney, or Vinod has in New Delhi, or Marcus in Brisbane. So it's been a great opportunity to just see a whole different part of the world and think about how we're recording, or how you guys are recording and working with community in that. So I just want to thank you very much. Are there any questions from anybody that we?
I have one. Since virtual cloud storage, etc., is contextually in a different world to the real world we live in, there may be data hubs of that. I think the concept of how do you keep it on country becomes very, very difficult. And it moves to how do you control context? So no matter where it's watched in the world, it's watched contextually appropriately. Because if you want to physically limit something that can be copied, it becomes very hard to say that it can only be seen from a particular location, because reality is the ability to take that elsewhere. And this goes the same for an oil canvas. as much as it does for rock art. It is something that can be misused, and we haven't got good governance around making sure that not only are things used with permission, but they're used with an understanding of current context, and that context may change according to that community.
Comments, guys? Do you agree with Marcus? Disagree with you?
Just a quick little thing to add to that.
Sure.
I'm not sure where it's at the moment, but the Northern Territory Library is part of one of the partners in a project called the Yiricha database, which then became called the R Story database. And I'm not sure where it's at now, but it was very interesting in addressing exactly what you're talking about. It consisted of a cloud-based storage, but also a whole lot of community libraries which had hard drives. People could scan photos, audio, upload video, tell stories, and everything was tagged at levels of access. So this image might be suitable for men only. This image might only be suitable for men of this clan group. This is highly sensitive material, and so people could go into the library and jump on an iMac and access a whole range of stuff depending on who they were, from totally publicly accessible things to backed up, highly sensitive, only seen by one person, perhaps.
Wow.
Material. And that was a fascinating thing. I think it's still in existence. I don't know what iterations that it was around for about 20 years. I think some funding kind of dried up a little bit for it, but it was a really interesting kind of answer to that question.
Approach answer to the question, yeah.
So it also brings up potential conflicts with laws that come from a Western culture that we have about rights of access, no discrimination, and those types of things. And this is why I think context is really, really important, because at some point we're going to have a head-to-head over people feeling discriminated about something because of their gender, for example. I'm not allowed to look at something because of my gender. I feel that's discriminatory. How do we manage those contexts, especially when viewing may not be on local governed lands? And so I think it's a really important question, but I also think that's a bigger question that goes well beyond just Indigenous communities to the broader community around the world. How do we use virtual worlds, virtual environments appropriately?
Maybe we should ask you to do something about that towards the end of the year, Marcus. Or find something.
I don't think I've got clear answers, but I think we need to have some discussions on that.
Yeah, no.
I think it's very important because I think what's going on here is brilliant, not only brilliant preservation, but increased access without damage to country, if done right. And I think that improves understanding from people who haven't been to country. I'm lucky I spent a week in Gove with the Army 36 years ago, and it was an eye-opener for me working with the locals there. I loved it. It was great, but it was very different to any other place I've been. And I've worked in other Indigenous groups, with the other Indigenous groups as well through the Army, and they're all different. And that's very hard for people who like to group things into small numbers of groups rather than the reality of the world, and that there are many groups, and it's important to understand context.
I totally agree. Will and Alex and Scott, you've raised a whole lot of issues for us that I think will continue